IPRP meeting April 1st. And I just wanted to give some preliminary information about the restrooms. If you need to use them, they're located just off the lobby. If you turn to the left towards the cafeteria, there's restrooms, and there are additional restrooms located across the courtyard if you go to where the hearing rooms are. As you enter the auditorium is to the left, but the restrooms are to the right of that hallway. I also wanted to mention, in the case of a fire alarm or some emergency we need to evacuate, the meeting point for the people in this building is the Civic Center Plaza, which is head south, and it's in front of the City Hall. It's like a park area. So that's the assembly point for this building in case we need to evacuate if there's a fire or some emergency. And I have prepared an agenda, and does everyone have a copy? And it's just, tentative to give us an idea about, what we would be speaking to. And I guess by way of introductions, myself, I'm Eric Green from the PUC.
We're going to go around?
Yeah, just briefly.
I'm Doug Hamilton, engineer and geologist, working with A4NR.
Justin Cochran, California Energy Commission.
David Zismore, PUC.
Bruce Gibson from the County of San Luis Obispo.
Chris Wills, California Geologic Survey.
Jeff Bachberg, Director of Geosciences, PG&E.
Valerie Wynn, PG&E.
Norm Abrahamson, engineering seismologist at PG&E.
Stu Nishenko, seismologist, PG&E.
Gerald Strickland. I am responsible for PG&E's generation technical services.
David Weissman with the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility.
Okay, and if there's anyone on the phone who would like to identify themselves, we'd appreciate that.
This is Bob Anderson, Seismic Report.
Oh, thanks, Bob.
This is Region California Geological Survey.
And James Lowen, supervisor at Energy Division, just came in. So we were just going around a little bit with introductions. So without further ado, let's get started. And the first item that I was suggesting on the agenda is if we have any unanswered questions or anything that held over from our last meeting or from our last IPRP report number 10, and the PG&E did respond to that report, so we do have that posted on our website.
So, sure,
Yeah, Chris.
I'll just do a really brief recap of where I think we ended up with report number 10 and the response to that, just so we kind of know where I think we all know where I think we got to with that. Because report 10 was a discussion of the revisions to the 3D velocity model and also to the site-specific ground motion calculations, which include both a empirical adjustment to the ground motion, to the empirical amplification factor, and an analytical adjustment to the ground motion based on a propagation of the waves through a velocity profile. And to kind of recap both IPRP reports number 6 and number 10, the IPRP remains skeptical that the amplification factors being applied in both the empirical and the analytical approaches are exclusively site condition factors, so that it's a In the case of the empirical adjustments, those are from dominantly from two earthquakes at San Simeon and Parkfield, where it's difficult for us to understand how you can conclusively rule out path effects as being part of the effect, part of what's causing the amplification or de-amplification of the short period shaking. The analytical approach is a little bit different in that it is propagating the shaking through a profile, but that, again, that profile has been adjusted so it matches a kappa, which is basically based on the spectral shape that does the same thing. It actually it diminishes the short period shaking because of the shape of the spectra, if I'm correct on that. So the basic summary is it seems like both approaches are applying a empirical amplification or de-amplification of short period shaking, which we would like to see additional studies to show conclusively that that is exclusively a site effect, not either path effect or other effects in combination with the site effects. And so that's kind of where we ended up in IPRP report number 10, which reiterated some things that were said in report number 6. The response to that, to report number 10, kind of reiterated what we had understood you were doing from previous reports, reiterated that this is the right way to do it, and really did not tell us any further about how you would further justify using these as purely site factors rather than site factors plus other things. And so that's where we came out to after the response is my impression is you're not buying our argument that this is site factors plus other stuff that we're not convinced you can sort out. So if that's your impression, I think that's kind of where I think we ended up. Is that okay?
Yeah, that was one of it. The other question, and I'll be honest, I would need to be walked back through some of the materials to be sure I had that right, is that you went through and developed a 3D velocity model based on surface wave dispersion and the tomography, and it checked to some extent between the surface wave dispersion and tomography. But then in determining amplification, de-amplification factors, you were running one-dimensional models through that. And so I think there was a concern that in something that's that geologically complex, running a 1D model, propagating a plane wave through a 1D model wasn't going to get it. And sort of related to that, I was looking at your response to number 10, and you indicate that you have a 3D model that covers key structures, obviously critical parts of the plant. And that there's a line that says there are no plans to develop a 3D velocity model for a larger region. And I've always wondered, we haven't really talked very explicitly about the scale of the model that you have relative to a seismic wavelength, because we know that there's going to be averaging on the order of the scale of a wavelength, right? And whether it's a quarter wavelength or 2 wavelengths, but I just wonder how, if we did the math and figured out what a seismic wavelength is there a lot of variability within the scale of a wavelength? Obviously, depending on frequency, there might be, and how does that play into calculating the overall amplification, de-amplification?
Okay, let me respond. So I think what you just said is not a surprise to me. Okay, so I fully understand what you've been talking about. So let me start with what Bruce asked about on the model, because I think that's a little more straightforward. The scale of the 3D velocity model, as you recall, it was derived primarily for source characterization, looking for identifying faults and those types of things to help you for that. The scale of the model is therefore on the kilometers in dimension. It's the detailed model that's got cell sizes or element sizes of say 5 feet vertical and 20 feet horizontal. That's really restricted to about a 500 meter cube. Okay, so beyond that, then the scale just is very different, and that sort of fits with ideas of wavelengths as well. But in our site response, it is primarily, in the analytical models, it's primarily picking up the shallow effects on the site response. So I would say, again, the top 500 meters is really what it's limited to. That's part of why we don't think it may be as accurate as what we're using empirically at the longer periods, because those wavelengths are going to be now bigger than that, right? Couple second wavelength, and I'm looking at kilometers, right? Or excuse me, couple second period, I'm looking at kilometers of wavelength. That's really the way site response is done in engineering calculations. It's an adjustment of the shorter period waves to try to address the actual the site conditions that you can model. We have gone to using not a 1D model, but a broad suite of 1D models. This is again back to sort of standard of practice in earthquake engineering. We ran 3D models and had our own separate peer review panel of geotechnical experts reviewing that. And the conclusion was that we were still not confident enough in the results that were coming out. Primarily because we were not getting an improved fit to the observed ground motions at our two locations, the ESTA 27 and 28, our two free field sites. We didn't get an improved prediction of the ground motion there over what we get from our 1D models. So we have identified this as an ongoing effort on research to really calibrate that. To be able to really test a 3D model, you need more than a couple locations. And to do that, we have some opportunities to use some of the nodal array data where we had thousands of sensors out. However, they're only vertical component, because that's what's done in the oil industry, is vertical component. And our main interest is in the horizontal amplification. So we kind of have a mismatch at that point. And what we're looking at moving forward is, can we get a deployment of horizontal sensors more broadly, recording microtremor and small earthquakes that could then really be a good test and calibration of the whole 3D model. But so what we've done now is we run 1D models. For each structure, we're running 800 velocity profiles with a wide range of velocities there. So
Each structure being each building structure.
So the containment structures are one, the turbine building is another, the auxiliary building is another. And so for those, we run a suite of profiles. Those have variability of about 15% from our uncertainty from the tomographic model. And on top of that, we add another 20% random variability that has now the layers can be high and low, and it's not just a systematic shift of a velocity profile up or down. That range of profiles captures or encompasses all of the 1D velocity model borings that we had from the 1970s as well.
Is that, I mean, is that this is page...
Yeah. So the plot that you're showing
15, yeah.
is the range of 1D profiles from the 3D model.
Right.
On top of those, we put an additional 20% randomization about each base profile. So we get numbers...
Randomization of the velocity, VS.
The VS. And there's a standard sort of model that's used in the nuclear business, developed by Gabe Toro on the correlation. So one layer isn't randomly high and the next one randomly low. There's a spatial correlation that's derived, and we use that same model. So from that, we drive it with these profiles. They sample a range of nonlinear properties as well. So we use linear properties and two alternative nonlinear scaling properties. And so from that, that gives us our uncertainty in what the resulting site amplification is. So it's if you had a well-calibrated 3D site response, you would get less variability out than what we get when we drive the entire model with the 1D profile, to one side, on the low side or the high side, or with low velocity zones and so forth.
And have we seen those results? I'm sorry if I'm...
So those results are in the NRC submittal in December for their last set of RAIs. Did they
Yes,
get that?
we did provide that on December the 22nd.
So is that, maybe that's
Yeah.
this letter that I'm looking at.
Might be, yeah, I think that's
December 21st.
Yeah, so that doesn't include we plotted the 3D models. We didn't include a plot of all 800 profiles, but again, I can tell you it captures about a range of a factor of 2 from the low to the high. So we would have, let's say, as low as 2,500 meters per second and as high as 5,000, sort of in that range where we were seeing the differences in the borings before. So, and that's information. If you want to see plots of that, we can provide you, curves that show you what the full range is that's included.
Yeah, I get where I'm going, and I think we'll talk about it later, is just to understand how this is propagating, if you will, through the NRC's process.
Right, so that's where it goes. So what comes out of that is now not a hazard curve, but a suite of hazard curves with the uncertainties. Those are then put later into the structure and all the way into the risk calculation. So we just propagate that uncertainty all the way so we can see what's the resulting uncertainties in our risk value. And that's sort of the process. And I think Gerald will talk a little bit more about where we're going on the NRC plans.
Okay. But this material was submitted to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in December, as noted, and they in turn had some of their internal specialists review it, as well as they contracted with Southwest Research Center for Southwest Research Center to do independent runs, independent assessments to be able to validate the inputs.
And it's sidebar on this. It would be really helpful for me if I could get a list of when the NRC asked for more information and when you responded and briefly what your response was.
You should have received copies of all the requests for additional information.
Yeah,
and the detailed responses.
And the thing is, they all sort of interleaf in time, and I'll apologize for my own filing system, but I can't quite keep it straight as to where we're tracking. I mean, I have to reach out for help on that.
Valerie, can you take the action then to
Yeah,
capture
I
the
will.
list of
I will.
RAIs?
So let me make sure I understand your request, Bruce. From what point in time you would like, I guess, any a timeline, a chronology of when the NRC issued an RAI, when we provided a response, and a brief synopsis of what was in that response.
Right. Or
so it's really a timeline.
Yeah, it would be. I was looking at your website, and I didn't immediately see those there. Maybe simply posting them to the website that this RAI was issued by the. I mean, there was one back in March of last year. There was one on source. There was one on site characteristics. There was since there are no NRC people in there, I find their labeling of things completely opaque. They have audit report follow-ups, that just are really hard to penetrate. But if there are, so it sounds like they do an RAI, you provide them information, they go into some kind of audit process, and then they issue an audit report. And so I don't know if those could just be organized so we could see that this request was responded to here and this one was responded to there. That'd be.
You can give that action to me.
Okay.
If we said, let's say from the time the seismic imaging project report was submitted to the NRC, like September.
March 15th, 2015.
I think that covers it for me. Yeah.
Okay, so from since March 15, 2015, when we provided the NRC the updated models and analyses, any RAIs they issued on that report.
Help us track it.
Does that sound reasonable?
I think so, yes.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I appreciate that.
I was going to loop back on one of, just kind of clarifying, 'cause one of the things we've asked about, and a bunch of times, and I'm not sure it's a critical point, but we asked a number of times about why doesn't the velocity models and the profiles through the velocity models reproduce well the measured velocity profiles underneath the plant from back in the 70s. And there's an explanation for that with the difficulty of picking the first arrivals and so on. And then there's you also said you've have this increased uncertainty to certainly span beyond those measured values. One of the things that occurred to me is that you also have much more modern measured velocity profiles at the ISFC. And have you compared results, or do you have detail? Do you have a 3D model that goes that far up the hill, basically? And so you could compare the 3D model for that area with the measured profiles there, and have you done that?
The 3D model, the detailed 3D model does not go that far. So the broader, coarser 3D model does go up to that level. As you know, we've reviewed this. The key, or the site where we have the biggest difference between the 3D model and the 1970s profile is Site C, right? That has and that's really comes down to a low velocity zone that's about 100 feet thick, and whether that zone is truly low velocity or it's a pick, a different phase pick. Because right below that it comes to being a higher than average velocity, and those are things that happen when you can trade off on it. So our judgment in this is that the tomography at that depth has more ray coverage and is less likely to, or is more confident in that than the picks of that particular part of the profile. So you've heard that explanation.
I've heard that explanation.
Okay. So what we have done now is we did broaden our uncertainties in our 1D profiles to be sure that we captured that low range as well. So it's in there.
It's in the uncertainty.
It's in the uncertainty treatment at this
You don't
point.
believe those are good values, but they're in the uncertainties anyway.
Correct. So we bring it along in that way. But we have not. I have not seen a plot of the ISFC profile versus the coarser 3D model in that.
Yeah, that's kind of the whole. We're kind of forced to go back to these old 1978 profiles because that's all there was. And if there were modern profiles within your 3D velocity, within your 3D velocity volume, that would give us a lot more confidence in the help calibrate the model.
I think the real, getting back to having confidence, if we can have a dense array like the nodal array with a horizontal component, then you can map out the amplification and say, am I actually predicting that with my 3D model? If we do it on the vertical, now you have a huge uncertainty of translating vertical amplification with horizontal amplification. So that's why we haven't gone down that road, other than looking at what can we do to increase or get the right kinds of instruments out there for that purpose.
There are enough small earthquakes that
there are
in that immediate area.
There are. So even within a couple months when they were running the nodal array, we got about 25 little earthquakes that were recorded. So we have verticals from them, and that data is being evaluated over at Berkeley to see how this process could potentially work with horizontal information. So little earthquakes, again, are small, so these might be magnitude 1s or 0s to 1s, small earthquakes, but they're pretty frequent in that area. And we also think you can probably get something out of microtremor.
And give you a little bit more better azimuth distribution around.
Correct.
To see that.
And that's part of our long-term seismic program, separate from this, correct?
Well, that's what we're, yeah, the next phase as we're moving on is trying to say what things can we do to take on or address the uncertainties that exist now. And that would be one of the topics that we would do.
And just because you brought it up, one of the things we need to make sure we air a little bit is what is, AB 1632 studies have kind of finished. But the IPRP is continuing on for a few more years. And so it's the role of the IPRP is to review seismic hazard studies at Diablo Canyon. And I think that puts us into the review role for the only things that are going on, which is long-term seismic program. And if we have general agreement that that's what we should be doing, then that's what we will do. If not, we will have to have further discussions about that.
That was going to be one of my questions later on as to whether or not you had formed a charter for the next phase, that once AB 1632 closes and you move into more providing additional oversight for our long-term seismic program, whether or not you've had the opportunity to develop a charter.
We haven't written anything up. That's kind of the
But I think the
concept that got into the legislation was that there should be continued review of seismic hazard studies that are ongoing.
Right.
And so that's the.
Well, we have two, and the way that I look at it is, you have a process that's moving through the NRC, and frankly, that's a process that's quite opaque to me as an IPRP member. I will let Chris speak for himself. But we look at that tornado diagram, and especially the top of the tornado diagram, which has the greatest uncertainty and the least actual information in it right now. And so, to me, post 1632, the NRC process is nominally post AB 1632. I would still like to know in more detail how the NRC is treating the uncertainties, right? Because our charge was to speak to what are the uncertainties and to what extent can they be narrowed. And the top of that tornado diagram suggests there are significant uncertainties remaining. How do those play in to the NRC's formal process? And I just don't know enough about their process. That's one of the reasons that I was asking about this, sorting out the requests for information. But once those are all settled, 3,000 miles away, in a big building that I've been in once, on goes work. And I just don't know what to expect. But I would expect there a role for the IPRP to comment on whether we think, how we think it's gone in terms of assessing the hazard in the light of the uncertainties. That's really the issue here. And looking forward to comment on promising ways in which those uncertainties could be further reduced.
So the NRC they want to be sure that you have captured the uncertainties first of all, so that you don't leave them out. Everything is included and quantified, and you recognize what they are. Moving forward and reducing the uncertainties isn't in what the NRC is focused on. That's sort of longer-term research, but that would be an appropriate role, I assume, for the IPRP going forward to say, are these studies or proposed studies going to reduce the uncertainty? The big part at the top of that tornado diagram is from ground motion models, and the reason it's large is the standard of practice is to use global data to build an average global model, and now we're applying it to a specific location and site. So we have gone as far as anyone has in trying to make these things as site-specific as possible. The next step really is a large one for the research community to move from taking data around the world and getting averages to saying, how does this vary spatially within California? Is it different from the north and the south? Is San Luis Obispo different? Is Diablo Canyon in specific different from that? That's where it's going in the next decade, I believe. And our goal is to stay on top of that and lead that. But That isn't happening at any other power plant or any other site that I am aware of in terms of really a detailed model. There are efforts going on in Southern California right now with SCEC to start to incorporate 3D basin effects from the Southern California basin into the building code based on 3D models. So you need to have a 3D geologic model, a velocity model, run simulations, but then you need the data to be able to confirm that, check, right, and make sure all that's working.
Well, to parameterize the model on the first hand and to ground check it on the
ground check, exactly. So we don't want to just take simulations without some ground truth to them as well. So that means additional data and how do we get out enough sensors. And that's really the topics that we're dealing with right now. Building a 3D velocity model for Central California. So not just Diablo Canyon, but really, say, 100-kilometer area of radius. Then how do you get enough data to calibrate that model? And then you implement it with large suites of numerical simulations. Now you can start to build a really site-specific ground motion model.
And in the meantime, and I may be stating the obvious, your 800 1D models with plus uncertainties, you're positing that captures the full range that you'd get if you actually did a 3D propagation.
And correct. Okay. I think it's already actually broader. 1D models tend to have larger excursions in one direction or another than a 3D model, just because they'll create a layer and it resonates or it doesn't resonate.
So I think, there's a lot of, the sciences, we're doing a lot of state-of-the-art stuff already here, and I think the research is going to continue to evolve in those areas. I think for me, I was encouraged to hear you say that you feel like we finished up a lot of the AB 1632 piece, and I think I would like to spend a little time talking about how do we transition really from the AB 1632 focus that we've had over the last few years on the site characterization to really how does the CPUC want to shape your mandate for going forward over the remaining life of the plant that's as the legislation.
And I think that's something that's important to do early, in that we go through a process every year of prioritizing the types of work that we do under the long-term seismic program, and it would be good for us to be able to have a separate session where you can see the longer-term plans that have been developed by the Geosciences Department and what they currently envision as the work for this year, for next year, for the next 5 years, and be able to then provide input as to whether or not we have the right priorities, or whether or not you see there's other work that should be moved up in the priorities, and we invest more money in that area than our current plan.
So I think, having a discussion about when we want to have that sort of discussion certainly would be right, for the next steps part of our agenda,
Right,
maybe, or
that's on the
we
agenda a
can
little
touch
farther
on that,
down.
or we can touch on that now, certainly, but it's certainly something we've been thinking about too. How do we transition?
This is an appropriate time.
Could I just finish the technical stuff?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
there's one.
I do think I want to hear Norm loop back to the whole.
The remaining
We're
questions from
still not
IPRP 10.
completely in agreement about the amplification factors.
So
I think that's the key thing.
Right. So
Okay.
on the amplification factors, I think one of your comments, or you said you believe that our empirical factors could have some path effects mapped into them, right? And so it may not be purely side effect. And we do, so I don't want to give the impression that I am saying our numbers are purely side effects. Especially if you look through the response to the NRC, now we have gone through and more formally identified the uncertainty in the path term. So how much of that number could be path effects and how much?
Yes, and I did notice that was in there.
And that's in there. We also ran sensitivities doing different subsets of data that we used to remove the path effects. Remember, we tried to take out an event-specific path effect. And how much could we be off? So that uncertainty is formally identified and laid out. So I am sure there is some path effects in that
In those
terms. There has to be. What we've tried to do there is quantify what the size of that is.
Yeah.
The other part I think you got to is sort of, are we using the empirical data twice, right? And so that we are
So the analytical models are tuned to
that data, so are we getting the same answer because we're going in a circle? And I think that's not the case, and the reason I say that is for the empirical site terms, we use the data from San Simeon and from Parkfield.
Right.
For the analytical site response, we need a site kappa. Okay, and that is based on spectral shapes, but of a different earthquake, so the
Right.
Deer Canyon earthquake.
Right.
So that really, there's no using the same recordings for two different purposes.
No, I realize that.
And
That's better.
that's better, okay?
Well, where's Deer Canyon though? It's sort of halfway between Parkfield.
No, it's
on
5
Aspen.
kilometers away.
It's right there in the airfields.
Okay.
It's
From a much different azimuth?
Not much different, but
it's 5 kilometers away instead of 35, for example, to San Simeon. So it's very close. It's a magnitude 3.5. So it generates a lot of high frequencies. So from that you can see the high frequency shape, and that helps you constrain what the kappa value is. So you need some value of kappa. If we had no information, we would go grab a generic value and have a very large uncertainty range on what the kappa is. So I think we have, again, careful in the statistics not to double use data. You can't use it, build your model and then use it to check your model, for example, those types of things. So the agreement between the analytical results and the empirical results at high frequencies was encouraging to me, that those two separate data sets, and one being Deer Canyon plus analytical model and the other being just the 2 earthquakes, are giving comparable results within the uncertainty ranges. At the long periods, that's not the case. They're different, and in our discussions with the NRC, they thought that difference might be due to path effects, which it could be, or it could be the deep side effects that aren't captured in the analytical model. And so by our empirical approach gives us higher low frequency amplification, and that's the model that we gave higher weight to. So we would have reduced our low frequency part if we had only used the analytical model in that particular case. And almost, as I said, almost all analytical modeling is the top, let's say 500 meters, so it's not going to really, it's not intended to capture 1 or 2 second period waves.
And I've mostly focused on the high frequency part of the spectrum anyway, and so because we talked early on about the range of frequencies the planet is most sensitive to being relative to high frequency. I kind of focused there, and just kind of to reiterate, it's good that the empirical factor is based on two earthquakes, and the analytical model kappa is based on a different earthquake, and that increases your total number of earthquakes that you're tuning this model to, from a really small data set to a really small data set. And so it makes me very nervous to have all of the earthquake shaking spectral shapes tuned to a empirical spectral shape that is from only 3 earthquakes. Am I reading this completely incorrectly, or is that?
Yeah, so we don't run just one kappa. So part of our,
you have a range.
We have a range of kappas. That's part of our 800
Right.
site models. Is we have different velocities, we have different nonlinear properties, and we have different kappa values.
Right.
So the kappa values that are in there are 0.02 to 0.05.
I cut it off like 0.03.
0.03.
Centered at 0.04.
I'm sorry, centered at 0.0. So 0.03, 0.04, 0.05. Right, are the 3 kappa values that we're using. If you went empirically to correlations of kappa and shear wave velocity, you will probably be centered more at the closer to the 0.03 range as opposed to the 0.04 range for velocities as high as 1,200 or 1,000 meters per second. part of our site has velocities in the 600 to 700 meters per second, and those are more 0.04 type of kappas. It comes back to what do you expect the kappa to be, and what is kappa, right?
Yeah, don't ask me.
Don't so, it helps to have again a physical idea. Is kappa is treated as damping in the deeper structure due to fracturing in the crust.
Right.
So when we go to the east and we're in unfractured granites or whatever it's going to be there, then we get low damping and low kappa values. When you're in the Franciscan, where things are pretty beat up, the kappa values tend to be higher. So it's not a surprise to be getting kappas of 0.04 seconds in that area.
And just to kind of loop back through this, the 0.04 is a perfectly ordinary California Coast Range beat up old rock kind of a value, because that's what's all around it. But everything you've done right near the plant in terms of measuring velocities, that's the hardest dam rock in the Coast Ranges. And so when you have the really high velocity material, it's kind of a fundamental disconnect where you go out and measure this really high velocity material, and the kappa doesn't reflect that.
Right.
It's just the same as the surrounding area.
Right, and that comes back to where does kappa come from? And it really isn't the top 100 meters.
Yeah, it's not the upper half kilometer. It's not your
we
500.
we kind of say it's a kilometer or something, and it's a bit of a vague description because it depends how deep the fracturing goes. So even if I had a strong, an intrusion of a really competent material, but it's in a busted up framework, then the waves will propagate through that fractured material, and you'll see the lower kappa.
And do you specify, is kappa a parameter of a half space below the model, or is it variable?
Kappa is the parameter of the net effect from down at 8 kilometers all the way to the surface.
Okay, so it's an adjustment after the fact of the.
Really, we have an idealized model that we use, and kappa reflects the difference from our idealized model. This is an omega
So
squared
it's
model.
it's almost like a fitting
Correct.
parameter.
And it looks like damping, and so we explain it by damping. So it's because we don't model all that fracturing deep that we have to get at it empirically. One of the topics we have going forward is a worldwide search to see how often do we see high velocities and low kappas, or excuse me, high velocities and high kappas. Is this 0.04 and this velocity that unusual? We see a whole range of kappa values at rock sites and even at hard rock sites in the east. So there's a peer report that just came out, I think last week, I believe. I hope it's online. On kappa, so it's a study of kappas up in British Columbia and then kappas in the East United States.
But again, measured over kilometer scales.
It's not. It's measured at the. It's measured from the recordings.
Right,
So it's
right.
whatever
it's aggregated.
we attribute it to this bigger area, but I can't say we measured it over that area because it's not a.
Okay.
We don't go to the lab and measure kappa.
Yeah, no, I'm getting it. Do we see it vary with the azimuth that the wave comes in at?
There's variability in what the kappas are. And you can see sort of standard deviations of when we have a measurement of kappa between standard deviation of 0.02 is not an uncommon change in what the kappa value could be from an individual realization.
I mean, that's because my mind goes back to the thought that, we want to get to where we're propagating through that 3D model so we can account for not the path effects, but you can call it the incident angle on the chunk that's going to affect site response. And the thing that's notable is that all that's been illuminated from the east.
Correct.
And nothing from the major threat, which is to the west.
That's right.
So, I mean, Therein lies the
Correct.
the
That's
rub.
a limitation of the available data, and our approach to trying to deal with that is we have the variability that we build into the ground motion model as well. So there's that standard deviation in the ground motion model that reflects this kind of variability as seen all around the world when you lump it together, but it hasn't separated out and saying, what do I get from sources to the west? What do I get from sources to the north? It's all blurred into one broad standard deviation.
Have you tried to separate it out as epistemic uncertainty in the idea that either our empirical amplification factors are appropriate for all azimuths, or they're not, and you're stuck with a more of a global average?
Yeah. So the approach that we've used for the variability of the ground motion model is called the single station sigma. I think you've heard that. That is a model that has only taken out the average at a site, so averaged azimuthally.
Right.
So the variability of different directions in the empirical data is left in the standard deviation. All we've removed is an average term, again, averaged azimuthally. So that's how that variability was derived.
Yeah.
So our concept would be azimuthal changes in the wave propagation is part of the standard deviation, the single station sigma.
And when you do that, you end up with a variability around your amplification factor. And what I was asking is, have you considered the concept that amplification factor is actually measuring something else, or is not appropriate for global, and then you have to center your distribution of amplification just around zero, around some global average, basically. You see what I'm saying? This is in your field, not mine.
We would always say that what we measure, it has the actual value plus other terms, for example, that we haven't averaged out yet enough, right?
Okay.
And so that's part of how we get that uncertainty range.
Yeah.
If I had 100 recordings, I'd have a much tighter range than with 2.
Okay, so you could, if you did that, you would center it at maybe you center it at the global average, but you'd have a tighter uncertainty range.
Right.
Okay.
But then when we center it on the global average, right now, if we did that, we would be having a low probability of observing the data that we observed. So it is
the data you've got is different.
Different, right?
Yeah.
And so now it's is it different? Is it enough and different enough to complete it? Our uncertainty range does include the global model. Okay, so we're not.
But it's centered on the
correct.
amplification factor.
Correct.
Yeah. And so that's kind of where I see the uncertainty. It's not whether you've characterized that correctly, if it's an amplification factor. The question is it a site amplification factor or not?
Right. And then, which is how much, let's say, contamination, right, or other pieces are in there.
Yeah.
And that's what we have quantified, our estimates of what is the potential path or source effects that we didn't properly strip out and are now still showing up in what those terms are. But if we centered it on the global model, you can't make the statistics work, right? Because I can't.
Well,
centering means I've got a symmetric distribution.
On the global model, and then you have to say that that's a fairly extreme path effect to actually get your recordings.
Correct. And so we would.
And how much path effects can there be? Is that kind of beyond the range? What you see as path
and so
effects?
the answer is yes. It's beyond. So we would be pushed well beyond one standard deviation path effects for these 2 events happening. So because I've seen those things twice. But the approach that is used in seismic hazard and the same in the NRC is mean-centered estimates, best estimates with uncertainty ranges. And you bring that uncertainty all through the process. We don't just stop it in one place. It gets propagated all the way into the structure, so you can get the uncertainty of the performance of the structure and so forth. But I think we're clear, right? I think you know our evaluation of what we've done. There is additional work on those path effects and how much could they be showing up in the site term that's in that most recent NRC submittal.
Yeah, the one from December.
Correct.
Yeah, we saw some of that. Didn't really completely absorb it.
Right. So I think if you try to read through that, you can see in there the place that says, here's the path term, what it could still be, right, and its uncertainty and how that shows up in the end.
So that's kind of wrapping up what we said in report 10 and what we saw in the response. And I think what you've heard is some remaining skepticism, which I think Eugene doesn't think is entirely warranted. That's a good summary. But
And
we're struggling to understand that this is the correct approach and these are the right values, and that you really understand Kappa, and that is the right value to use for Deer Canyon, and it applies to the analytical model, and it's not.
And I would hope, so I think the only difference I'd have in the way you characterize that is we don't say we have a right value, we say we have a range of values. Now, is our range centered in the right place, and is it broad enough?
That's right.
Okay, and I think that may help you in trying to get your head around this, because if you ask me, do I have the right value? I'm probably sure we don't have the right value, right? That's the one thing I know.
It's in there someplace.
It's in there someplace, yeah.
But we need to explore those. It is those boundary events.
Right,
It's those extreme events that
And
are the ones that are.
that's what the NRC review was focused on as well. Do you have the uncertainty range properly captured?
So that supplemental material that was submitted to the NRC that they've reviewed in detail, I think is what you really need to see and focus some additional
Which
attention.
is that December 21st.
And then the NRC documentation, which should be coming out sometime this year.
Right now, they've performed an assessment of all the material that we've presented to them. They've done their own independent reviews by Southwest Research Center, and in turn, the next step would be for them to be able to finalize the documentation and submit a final report on the September this year type time basis. But in January, they did an initial acceptance of the ground motion response spectra that is part of that January or December submittal that we provided to them as we modified the ground motion response spectra.
The January letter from NRC.
That's correct. And so they provided
I think we shared that with the IPRP.
We got that as well.
Right.
So they provided instructions for us now to use that ground motion response spectra and proceed forth with updating our seismic probabilistic risk assessment models and be able to then analyze the structure, systems, components that are important to safety.
But that ground motion response spectrum had standard deviations.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So while there's a curve drawn, there's a big range, and that range is maintained. So we put that all into the structure, and it goes all into the risk calculation. What is the uncertainty you get in the computed risk? So it doesn't just get collapsed into one curve and then it's gone.
And I think I'm always looking ahead, trying to explain this to the public, right? I'm trying to explain the public policy decision, which is going to come out of the NRC basically, whatever way it does. And in terms of whether we think the range and the spread of kappas is appropriate or not, feeds into this response spectrum with its
Correct.
bands. And the question is then, how do the extremes of those bands play into the overall PSHA, right? I mean, because out of that comes a sort of a yes-no determination that there's better than, there's less than a 1 in 10 to the 4th chance that it's going to be exceeded, right?
There is a mean hazard curve
Right,
but we don't just stop at the mean hazard curve.
okay.
We produce the uncertainties of the hazard curve. And as we go forward, those uncertainties are maintained and propagated into the structural response analysis. And then that is all propagated into the risk calculation. So we don't have one risk curve. There's the uncertainty and the risk numbers are all brought along.
So we're getting into the engineering side.
Correct.
Correct.
You can do the public
I'm
workshop.
the ultimate upstream guy. I'm the reflection seismologist, right? Now we're getting into the building engineering, and I'm, okay, I get it.
Okay, so Chris, would you care to summarize again where we are on IPRP Report 10? And
No, so
with Norm's explanation, does that help
Yeah,
you?
I think we're, I think we understand where we're both at. We're still going to work on IPRP and staff kind of keep going through this, trying to make sure we have kind of pinned down where you're coming from and the basis for that, and understand that best of our abilities. If we come back on this, we will. But I think that the outcome of the AB 1632 phase of the IPRP is this focus on site amplification factors, and how ground motion is computed at the plant. I think that it's a bit of a change from what was envisioned when AB 1632 was written, and from what you guys expected when you started working with us, because we really liked the tornado diagram that I think was provided in one of our first meetings, 2011. But then we said, there's other stuff up there at the top of that tornado. And so we, IPRP Report 6 and 10 are focused on that stuff that's still there at the top of the tornado. And going forward, I think that's where we are going to focus, is not the AB 1632 characterize the faults and how they affect the hazards, but characterize all of the factors that affect hazards at the plant. How can you do seismic hazard studies to reduce the uncertainty on those different factors? And so that's, going forward, it's the same charge that the IPRP had under AB 1632, is review seismic hazard studies proposed by and conducted by PG&E, comment on the goals and methods of those studies, and then when those studies are completed, comment on how well those results met the goals, which is to reduce the uncertainty in seismic hazards.
Okay.
And so that's, we're doing the same thing. The tornado has kind of grown, and that's Norm's fault.
Well, I mean, and some of that is, as Gerald noted, many of those activities are really part of our long-term seismic program.
Yeah.
So I think as we think about, transitioning from the AB 1632 focus with the site characterization and taking the forward view of, kind of the IPRP and how they fit within our long-term seismic plan, and kind of setting up, I think, some more specifics about, how often are we going to meet, what sorts of things are you looking for, as Gerald mentioned, what's our 1-year plan, what's our 2 or 3 year plan, getting your feedback on some of those proposals. I'd like to, I think, first think about, I think as we've had a couple of meetings before, you've talked about doing an AB 1632, maybe kind of a letter to the commission saying that we've completed the AB 1632 studies, and here are all the reports that we produced and PG&E's responses. Pursuant to legislation, we're now going to be shifting our focus to the long-term seismic plan. Is that something that you're planning to do, or?
We have actually talked about a wrap-up report and even public meeting. I know Bruce wanted to have some kind of a public meeting thing and summarize AB 1632.
Just probably meshes well with that kind of review. I guess the thing that I trying to sort out in my head is when to do that relative to the work the NRC is doing. Because it's really, these are all studies, right? This is all talking about the raw material that goes into the final hazard analysis. And, Chris has said on a number of occasions that the interesting path we've taken here is to show that we've discovered that side effects are the important thing, are the most important thing, not so much the source characters. I mean, it was good that we did the source characterization. The only exception to that as a general statement I would take is that the work in the Irish Hills was not definitive. That our opinion is the work in the Irish Hills did not show definitive structure there. And both from the standpoint of how that's going to get treated within the NRC hazard analysis, because there's no fault to go point to. I mean, in our IPRP opinion is there's no fault. And I know we've talked about the generic, there's going to be an earthquake somewhere in the Irish Hills response, and that gets weighted by a certain amount within the hazard analysis. And I want to see, the results of that. That to me is still potentially a source of uncertainty, depending on how that's treated in terms of its potential effect. But it's also then a question of whether it's worth spending research effort in trying to pin that down better. Yeah. It's and I guess the thing that just nags at the back of my mind is in the Fukushima event is that they didn't have the source characterized to the extent that it wasn't a side effect that died. It was the source. And just in terms of leaving no stone unturned and dealing properly with uncertainty in that place where we don't have information, that's one that I keep rattling in my head. So. And again, let's do AB 1632, wrap up, and here's our reports, and now we chart a course. I think that makes a good public meeting if we can get some slides that express what, I care very much about communicating this in a fair and honest way to the public. They are certainly owed that, as it's the ratepayers' money that's funded of these very interesting discussions. So I'm amenable to trying to figure out how we do that this year, if that makes sense.
To some extent, we did that for a different audience at a year ago, Seismological Society. Summed up all the studies and for the technical audience.
And actually, we had an open house too at the Energy Center down in San Luis Obispo when the 1632 report was released. So you can draw from those experiences.
And then Senator Mine had a public workshop down there as well to present some of this.
Yes.
Down there for that. So there's been a little bit of that. But there has not been a IPRP letter to PUC. Eric, is that something that the commission would be looking for, expected of us to say we finished phase one and gone to another phase?
I'm not aware that the commission or the commissioners are expecting that or looking for that. It's not on anyone's calendar.
Yeah.
It's not been brought up to me by any of the commissioners or their advisors, but that's not to say that we shouldn't go ahead and prepare it
I think it would be reasonable to have all our reports in one place, and PG&E's responses in that same place. Documents what we've done.
Well, and I think certainly it's my view that we have finished a phase of IPRP review. All of our comments got incorporated to the extent they're ever going to into submittals to the NRC. That's moving forward in the licensing process. And then now we have, there will be ongoing studies that are going to focus on some of the same issues. And then we have a continuing role because of legislation that we can be reviewing some of these as they go forward. So that kind of, say phase one is done and so phase two is starting, is something that we could.
And I mean, and that actually, if you were like, you're starting phase two, is that really the point that, you would have your public meeting in San Luis Obispo really under the rubric of phase 2, and you can kind of recap, what you did previously, but, that's kind of closed out, and here's how we're engaging and the feedback we're offering really over the next few years on the next set of seismic plans.
And what your focus
I mean, does
will
that
be
kind
and
of
so forth.
make sense to kind of kick it off in
Well,
the
that-
public that way on some of the phase 2
Let's
things?
see.
Or
We're kind of sort of on the agenda. That would depend on what phase 2 seismic studies would be.
Well, or phase 2 of our work, Chris, because one of the things, I mean, when's the NRC expected to finish? It's 2017, something?
So they finished the complete review of the hazard submittal and provide that documentation package by approximately September of this year. That was what the letter said. From there, then, we'll continue with our updates of our seismic probabilistic risk assessment, and that we have until September 2017 to be able to then submit those results, and then we'll then review those results.
Because I think it's possible that maybe the start of phase, we've done our comments on the material going in. Maybe if that's the end of phase 1, the start of phase 2 may be our comments on what the NRC produces as conclusions of that.
But if that's not, well, you're saying that September of this year is NRC is going to,
On the hazard.
the hazard plan.
Right.
And I'm not commenting on risk. I'm not going to do any of the
Right.
engineering there.
Well, I mean, we have to make that clear as to what our, what our expertise is,
Yeah.
such as it is.
Yeah.
So-
Okay. Yeah. So,
I mean, I think if we have thoughts about how they treat the situation in the Irish Hills, or how they treat Kappa, or how they, amplification, de-amplification, did they buy the 2 earthquake, 3 earthquake empirical results or not? I mean, I think we should comment on that.
yeah.
When
When it's out.
when it's out.
Admittedly, yeah, sure.
But whether we want to say, we wrapped up our comments going in and call that good, that's, I don't know.
Do you think there's because a lot of demand in the San Luis Obispo area for more technical information of this kind, more presentations like this?
I think there's always interest when we declare it. I think in terms of demand,
Yeah.
we have elections and water and
Yeah.
homelessness and a
Lot
number of other things
lots
competing.
A lot of other issues in the
Right.
public eye now, and it seems like there is there's always a public interest in the plant and the issues around it in the area.
Right, absolutely,
That's it.
anytime. I mean, especially with Senator Monning now has, as you know, has the the bill suggesting an economic analysis, closure, so forth and whatnot. So there's always interest in it. And I think we should decide, lacking any public outcry for us to come and present, I think we should decide when there's a good time to offer our observations on that. I would like to think we do it this year. If we wait for the NRC or don't wait for
Right.
the NRC, I don't know.
That's kind of I don't know on that one either. So maybe we can continue the discussion and loop in, Mark Johnson, unfortunately couldn't make it to the meeting today, and then Bob is on the phone, so he can chime in with any opinions that he.
Bob is here.
Yeah.
I think it'd be prudent to wait till after we see what the NRC says.
Okay, thanks.
So you're talking about late fall of 16, maybe 17?
Late
Yeah.
fall this year. And Chris, did you also say that Ree was looking at some of the materials in more detail even now?
Yeah, and she's gone through the response and was going to make it here. Had I don't know, what was the story with the train, Ree? It didn't get here.
I've had those days on the train. They're not pleasant.
Yeah.
Well, train returns to Davis.
Oh.
For reasons
There was a trespass incident. So, but anyway, yes, I think I would like to read the PG&E letter to NRC in more detail, the December or November letter. The DCL 15154, especially in the kappa, the part where the kappa is evaluated or the uncertainty of the kappa is determined.
Okay, and you have that report, correct, Ree? Or
Yes,
should,
I do have that report. I did not see, because previously you mentioned that you develop a range of hazard curves for later for risk analysis. I do not see that in this report. Has that been developed? Is it in another document?
It should be in the appendix to what we sent in December. So look in the appendices, I believe there's tables that have the fractals on the hazard curves.
Okay, I need to look into that in more detail.
Yeah, if you
I
can't
also know,
find it, just contact me and then I can be sure to show you where it is.
okay, thanks. I also noticed a couple of references in that report reference to, which are PG&E calculation files. Reference number 9 and 10. One of them is the update of the ground motion response spectra using the analytical and empirical type term approaches. And the other one is the VS kappa scale factors.
Okay, I will
we'll
get
we'll
those
add
to
that
Valerie.
we'll add that to our list.
Thanks.
And Ree, I guess I should provide these to Eric Green, and Eric will provide them to you.
Yeah.
Does that work for you, Eric? Okay. And so just to recap that request, please provide the documents referred to in references 9 and 10 on ground motion spectra and the VS kappa factors. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
And I also mentioned to Mr. Chris, it would be nice if we could reproduce your ground motion response spectra at the point that is, because it seems like in that letter, the letter mentioned that this ground motion response spectra is going to be a final version that would go into the risk analysis. For the screening, for risk assessment, it would be nice if IPRP could, reasonably reproduce that response spectra. So that means I probably will ask Norma again for the most update input files.
Sure, so there's two parts to that. One is the reference rock hazard curve, and I can give you all the files that we ran, and you've got it'll run with the program, so that should be fine. The second part is going from this reference rock condition to the site-specific condition. And so in NRC terminology, this is called approach 3, but it takes the rock ground motion and then amplifies it and then puts it all back together into a hazard calculation on the top. So there's a separate program for that I can send you. You'll be able to read it easy. And then there's a whole stack of files that come from the site response calculation. So it reads those, it takes a hazard curve from rock, breaks it back into scenarios, amplifies each of the scenarios, and then sums it all back up into a hazard curve again. So if I give you that and the inputs, then you should be able to put things back together and reproduce it and understand what all the steps are.
Okay, that would be great.
So I'm going to capture that as please provide the reference rock hazard curve, and please provide the separate program and files on the site response calculation.
Correct.
Okay.
And Jennifer just should know how to do this now, so you should be able to ask her, because she went through, we did something very similar in class. So.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions from folks on the phone?
So I think that's, we're still, these are kind of the remaining issues in phase one of IPRP. And I think we will at least be able to do a summary of where we got to through that. And I think we had this huge array of other studies, which we summarized in IPRP reports 7, 8, and 9. And that, in general, characterized a aspect of the input to the hazard and decreased the uncertainty in that input to the hazard, with the exception of the Irish Hills. And so that's the kind of the overall review of all of the AP 1632 studies is kind of summarized in the reports. And I think we could do a wrap-up letter there. And then so there are remaining issues moving forward. And I think, as we get going, are you prepared to talk about the kind of investigations that you guys that are planned and are being discussed at PG&E for site, path, source effects, seismic arrays to get data sets to start capturing some of those factors and kind of what the next phases of investigation are going to be? Is that something we...
I think that might be, maybe we talk about what the long-term seismic program and some of the activities coming up there,
Yeah.
and what's planned. And then I guess we would look for feedback from you, it's kind of like as we move into the next phase,
Right.
about whether you agree with our priorities, whether
Right.
you think there are additional studies that we should consider. I think that would really be if we, establish the next IPRP meeting to kind of look at phase 2.
Right.
I would say our approach would probably be to come in and share with you what we have planned right now, and then seek your feedback on that. Does that sound reasonable
Yeah, I
to
think
you?
that's it. Yeah, I don't really expect you to have a couple hours of presentations of fully
Not
plans.
today, no, Chris.
No. But
It's a broader portfolio.
yeah,
And I'm sure there are different, within that portfolio, things that focus on this area or this area or this area. So I think it would probably be good for us to share with you what we're considering right now, and
Yeah.
then, and again,
yeah. I
get
think
your
we can certainly
feedback
have
on that.
a broader kind of, maybe can get a kind of a broad brush discussion of where the long-term seismic hazard program is going, and then maybe get talk about when we can have a further meeting to go into more details. And probably we're not going to give you probably any feedback at this point about what we think your priorities are, should be, or what whether any of these investigations are worth doing or not. But we could get a broad brush overview at this point.
I do have one that I really want to have us make progress on, which is accelerometers in our smart meters.
Well, I heard about that one. Is that moving forward?
It's not moving forward. So
That was a double or
that double, a lot of negatives in there. Yes, it's moving forward. It hasn't been approved, so that's what I want to not give false or tell you that we're doing this now, but we are still going down that path. Do you want to? I
think
talked
at this
too long,
point-
right? So that you want to?
No, I think at this point maybe it's, because we I don't know that we have the material, we're not ready to talk in detail
No,
about what our proposals
No,
are
I know you have.
and what's been approved and what's kind of being considered. But it sounds like probably the next step is going to be to work with Eric on when, like what our agenda, we could propose an agenda for that, and kind of what sort of timing would you like to get together to talk about that is.
Well, that part of it is kind of up to you as well, because do you have a fully fleshed out research program going forward? Or are there too many things that are still up in the air?
Well,
I've been hearing for at least a year about a densified seismic network. And where has that gotten to? I heard about the smart meters months ago, and that's really exciting. And if that's not going anywhere this year, that's too bad. But I'm sure there are a number of other things that are kind of in different stages of development. And so,
look into the early warning system that was at that time Senator Padilla got through.
well, that's not a PG&E issue as much as everybody else's
The short
seismic
answer
network too.
is no, it really can't. We don't have the speed for early warning. This would be more for really getting the kind of data you need to be able to regionalize and make site-specific ground motion models. So just very dense microzonation of the ground motion model is essentially what we're talking about.
I think what might be helpful is, because we've been focused here in the IPRP on the site characterization work, but we probably haven't ever presented to you, I think, the whole portfolio of what we've currently got going on, outside of that. So that might be kind of, here's what our current portfolio is and some of the other studies that are already underway, when they're going to be completed, and then kind of what we've been considering, going forward. That, I think, would be a good way to set the stage for phase 2. Yeah. All right. So let us talk offline and get to you, Eric, and see, when might be a good time to have that discussion. Okay.
Yeah, actually, this is more of a PG&E issue than an IPRP issue. But one of the side parts of that, AB 1632 came with PUC processes and ratepayer funds to pay for all these investigations. And is that whole administrative part of it finished up, closed out? The investigations that were committed to and the funding that was provided under AB 1632, that was all.
Well,
is that kind of all? We're thinking of the seismic hazard review part of it under IPRP is kind of being finished off and being closed out, and kind of make sure the administrative side of that is as well.
Well, I think is go ahead, Gerald.
I think we're about ready to close out the funding aspect and be able to report to the CPUC what has been expended under this program.
Yeah.
But we were really leaving that up to you finalizing your efforts before we went ahead and completed that.
That's been done. Okay.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons, because there are different cost recovery mechanisms for the AB 1632 studies, and those have been reviewed as part of the Energy Resource Recovery Account. And that was a certain, amount of money that was authorized for those studies. So I think for us, one of the reasons, in asking, like, are you going to do a closeout report, that would really help inform our actions and what we say to the CPUC. Yep, the IPRP has said that we're finished with that phase, and now we're moving to looking at activities that are under a different cost recovery mechanism. And that really helps us be able to say definitively.
And so that's long to, and we got into this early on where I think you expected us to review only those studies that were under the AB 1632 cost recovery part, and we don't care about where the money comes from.
Right. But I mean, we like to have those bright lines, because it does become challenging in the regulatory environment when it's kind of blurred and things get fall in the gap.
And I think that's we will continue to be scientists and not care about where that comes from. And
we will assume money will come from somewhere.
As long as you are doing seismic hazard studies, and somebody's told us to review seismic hazard studies, we will assume that our purview is all of them.
This is John Eastman. Can I address that point?
Sure, John.
Certainly, John. Oh, go ahead.
As you know, I represent the Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility. in PUC proceedings. In the last PG&E general rate case, made review of the long-term seismic program a part of the Diablo Canyon seismic study balancing account, the same as the AB 1632 studies. So they're all currently subject to the same form of cost recovery through the annual ERRA proceeding at the PUC.
Okay. The IPRP thinks that's a good idea.
So does the Alliance.
Okay.
Very good.
Yeah. For my part, I will continue to ignore where the money comes from and just review the studies as they get done. Okay. What more do we have then? I think we talked about a AB 1632 phase wrap up. It does seem to make sense to do the after NRC better review next fall. We've talked about
Say that again, the trouble.
So we talked about an AB 1632 phase wrap up, which I think we've discussed as after NRC finishes their review next fall.
Assuming that NRC is on schedule for September, you know, if they're going to delay it for
I said fall. So
fall, yeah.
Which could be a couple, yeah, and that can stretch too. But I think in terms of getting the next phase going, that can certainly be earlier. That's more dependent on your being ready to lay out what the long-term seismic program is and has planned. And what, you know, interesting if, you know, PG&E has completely moved on to this seismic array-based source path and side effects, or if there's continuing follow-up studies in more of the source characterization side. So if that's any of those different pieces, would be interesting to keep track of. So that kind of leaves the whole ball in your court, I think.
Okay,
So,
well,
but
as Eric always reminds me, I don't set the IPRP meetings, but we can propose a date to Eric and a proposed agenda and see if that works for you guys.
And I would, yeah, because I think we're almost starting new.
Mm-hmm.
We want to hear about the full range of studies that you have planned. We may come up with things that are not within that range and say, well, why aren't you doing this? And so I think that's part of what our charge is.
I think certainly the continuity, we've been on this very interesting path.
Yeah. And I think this is, you know, I think we've focused on a range of studies that I think are going to continue to be the focus. But there are probably a number of other things that can be ongoing. If you're still trying to figure out, you know, if there's still people working on the 3D seismics of the Irish Hills and trying to get the reflection seismology to work in ways that would convince us, that'd be kind of intriguing.
Or other ways of assessing potential source mechanisms there.
Mm-hmm. But that depends on, I think, you putting together a listing of programs that are going forward and a listing of investigations and a outline of plans for each of those investigations, timelines, and goals, and tornado diagrams. That is a good. I do like this tornado diagram as a way of summarizing the importance of a study for hazards.
All right, so then, just to recap, I've got 5 action items. We will, since March 2015, provide a timeline of the NRC RAIs issued, PG&E's response, and a summary of the information provided in the response. We're going to provide the documents from reference 9 and 10 on the ground motion specter and the BS kappa factors. We're going to provide reference rock hazard curves. We're going to provide the separate program and files on site response calculations and we will provide to Eric a proposed agenda and a date for a meeting on really what our current long-term seismic plan is, and share that with you and work to get your feedback on that.
I think you said reference rock, the reference rock hazard
Hazard
curves.
curves. Mhm.
And I think what Ree was asking for was input files that go into the program to create the reference rock.
The input files, okay.
Input files for that.
Input files, okay, thanks for that clarification. All right,
And I think, kind of like to kind of layout of the listing and types of investigations going forward to not be next fall. I'm thinking more, this is, doesn't need to be more than a couple months in the future. But
I agree with that. I think
Oh.
that's a good time.
yeah. Sometime in the second quarter seems like a good date
Sometimes
to
the second-
target. We're in the second
we're
quarter
in
now.
the second quarter already.
Yeah,
yes.
so
Yes.
we'll work towards that.
Okay.
All
Because
right.
That would be good to have that
And then
laid out, and then we can start working on.
All right. And then you're going to consider whether you're doing some final report on phase 1 to the CPUC. And you think that you might still like to have a local meeting, but not until
Yeah,
the
that
fall of this year or sometime, fall of this year, maybe even early
When
next
When
year,
NRC finishes.
when the
and then-
NRC finishes.
Well, and then they're likely to have a review report that's not less than 10 pages. And so it might take us some time to review that.
Okay. Okay. Now, that helps give us kind of, a little timeline for activities for the next year, too.
And then we have a IPRP authorization that extends for a number of years,
Through the license.
which is 2025.
Mhm.
And think about the discussion for next time when we start talking about the programs within the long-term seismic program. How often IPRP should be meeting, how often you kick off a new program, how often you have milestones within your programs. We don't really want to be commenting on projects as they get finished and after they get finished. And so that having a frequent enough meeting so that we have meaningful input as programs are planned, not exclusively review on the back end. And then, but not so frequent that we have or just kind of
It becomes bothersome.
All right, well, we'll work on the balance.
There's a right frequency so we can provide input and.
And I would think our next session, as we give you insight to the long-term seismic program, will be the point where you've got enough information.
That's kind of, think about this as we put together the agenda for the next meeting. But discuss, because I would like to hear, the kinds of investigations that you are planning, whether or not they've been given the green light, whether or not they're fully formed, because we may hear ideas that we think are the right way to go, the best possible thing you could be doing, that others within PG&E don't think are worth doing.
And that's why I
So
mentioned
if
early
it's-
on that prioritization, I think, is a critical component that you can help with.
Mhm.
Speaking to intent and speaking to the continuity of what we've learned so far.
Right.
Yeah. Okay,
Okay?
very good. We'll take that back. Thank you. Thanks for
Good.
setting up the meeting,
Yeah,
Aaron.
I think we've covered everything. We'll continue to keep the lines of communication open, and, feel free to contact us whenever, So we'll adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.